Morgan, first question goes to you, brother. What patterns can we be prioritizing and avoiding in the life of a pastor to be guarding against restless toil?
Man, I feel like that was directed at me. Maybe it was.
It said Morgan in bold, so I just wanted to.
Yeah. I think similar to what I just even shared was this concept of patterning our life after Jesus. So I think often we take on the faith of Jesus, but we don't take on the patterns of Jesus. And so as we think about, how do we prioritize patterns? I think of, patterns of Jesus' own life. So what did that look like? He Sabbathed. He rested. Making that a priority in our lives, in a world that's seeking to rob us of that day. I think he was a man of prayer, who literally retreated and pulled away from everybody, saying, "I don't have time for you right now because I need to go pray to the Father." He was a man of feasting. He loved to eat with his friends, making time for deep biblical community, making that a priority in his life. What else did he do? He pulled away in solitude, just getting quiet and alone and not. That's different than isolation, right? Solitude and isolation are different. Solitude is restorative. Isolation is all about me. He lived a life of slowness. Even that that hurried, unhurried life that we just talked about. He intentionally walked, lived his life at a pace that we all would say, Jesus, there was a much more efficient way that you could have lived. Patterns to avoid, I think, again, so as we think about Jesus' life, avoid the Pharisees, right? Not that he necessarily avoided the Pharisees, but there's these people that we will encounter that we're never going to change their minds. And so, man, we need to use wisdom and discernment to recognize how much time do I need to spend here and how much time, when do I just need to move on? Also, responding not responding to the list of never-ending needs. That Jesus didn't heal everybody. Which I'm sure many had questions about, but the reality is we're going to be faced with, as pastors that are here, but even in our own lives, a list of never-ending needs. Unrealistic timelines is another one. I think as Jesus, he was well aware of what he could do in the time that he's been given. And it's fascinating that he actually, he lived about 30 years before he actually even did anything. He's like, 3 years is good enough. Safeguarding against the hurried life. I think, and then the last one that comes to mind is just balancing opportunities, not taking every opportunity without provision. That's placed with it. So often we're tempted to just take every opportunity. Again, I'm speaking, for those of you who know me, 100% from my own life. Not taking every opportunity just because it's a good deal, but waiting for opportunity to be matched with provision.
Awesome. Thanks, Morgan. Bo, similar question towards you, but we're going to kind of take it over towards rhythms of the church. So these patterns, priorities, which one of these are necessary for the culture and rhythms of the church that we can kind of infuse to guard the ministers and our congregation against restless toil?
I don't know.
Excellent. Liz. No.
Yeah, I'm thinking, I don't mean that. I could give a good answer rhetorically, sure. But in terms of how does that really happen? There's a sort of mystery to it. One thing I'd point out, as Morgan was talking, our church partners with, and I work for an organization called Practicing the Way, which is sort of connected to some of the things that Morgan was talking about, more inclined, I think, toward individual Christians, although trying to establish a culture in churches of being with Jesus and doing what Jesus did so that by the power of his Spirit, we can, over time, by God's grace, become more like Jesus. And so if you've never heard of that organization, I'd encourage you. They're putting together a lot of really great resources toward that end. But when I think about a church, one of the things Morgan said was you got to reorient around life under the sun by setting your heart on that which is beyond the sun and how that applies to our work. And so I think one way for a church and its culture is just the Sunday gathering is really crucial in that. I mean, every church is different, and yet most every church gathers together on the Lord's Day, as the church has been doing for every Sunday, really, since the Lord was raised from the dead on Easter Sunday. And so how you orient yourselves back to those things Morgan was talking about through the gathering of what happens on Sunday, I think it's a foundational place. Hebrews talks about that, just not neglecting that gathering, but more than just not neglecting it, what are we actually doing when we come together that is reorienting us to not toiling? Right. Because I think it gets really hard. You could talk about Sabbath, but first of all, unless we're Jewish, I don't know if that's prescriptive. I think it's actually not in regards to a 24-hour period. So there's some issues there. But then even if it were, what if you have members that work on Sunday? Is you just going to pick a day for the whole church and say, this is the day our church does this? Now, I've been to Israel on Sabbath days, and it's wonderful to see a community actually practicing it. It's actually powerful. There's no cars. There's people walking. The whole community is shut down in a way that would do what this question's asking very clearly. And so I think Sabbath is a real gift, but in terms of how to apply that to a whole church, that's really interesting to think about pastorally and otherwise. But I do think the Sunday gatherings an anchor point. I think it would be wonderful if there was a sort of culture of Sabbath. If not, maybe in smaller churches you could do a day where you've just agreed, hey, even though this isn't prescribed by Jesus, it's not a command, it's a wise practice. We could try to do this together, at least as a community or community group. But then the question, so much of it's connected to the minister. So I think it's really important for a congregation to have a culture of holding the pastor accountable, in a sort of way, because the pastor can't give what they don't have to a church. You're going to model and teach from your own life inevitably, and so I really do think that I'll bounce back to the first question, how important that is, not just to say that it sort of rises and falls with the pastor or the group of pastors, but I think unless they're embodying this not toiling, I just don't think they're going to be able to give it to the congregation. So how the congregation and the elders actually partner together to make sure that the pastors are leading in the way, not just with their teaching. It's one thing to get up here and explain a text. It's another thing to sort of embody that text with your way of seeing and being in the world that honestly just probably translates more than or as much as what you teach by God's grace. So that's why I'm like, I don't know, man. These are just some thoughts.
Great.
What do you think, Liz? You add to my thoughts.
Well, Liz, what a great segue, because Liz is the next one. Liz, I'm going to dive in on the next facet of this. So what are some ways that, like, restless toil in our lives, because there's consequences to it, how can that lead to poor emotional and spiritual health?
Well, I think what Bo just said is helpful, right? Like, I can sit up here and tell you what I think that you should do, but I also need to do those things, right? And so I think part of that is recognizing that we are all working for something, right? And so I think when we think about restlessly toiling, we have to stop and ask ourselves, well, what am I working for? Whose approval am I working for? What measure of success am I seeking to meet? And I think that the world has a lot of definitions for that, right? And the Lord wants us to lay aside those definitions and look at His. And His definition is not busyness, right? Like, there's no crown in heaven for being busy. But there is a call to be faithful. And so we can do our work faithfully by recognizing, like Morgan said, that we have limitations. When we refuse to do that, then we start neglecting our spiritual life. Then we start burning out. Then we start not having time to do the things that the Lord calls us to do. There is maybe not a command to take a Sabbath, but there is a command to rest in his work, right? There is a command to recognize that our work is not to hold all things together. That is his job to do. So I think spiritually speaking, if we are not willing to lay aside our work and trust that the Lord will complete it in his time, then we are basically pretending to be God and pretending to be infinite when we are actually finite. I think emotionally speaking, there's a lot of things to say about that. Thanks. We just finished a class on emotionally healthy relationships. And so I think that there are lots of ways that in our busyness, we try to run away from the way that we feel. And I think that like our culture also celebrates that. Like think your way through a problem, work your way through a problem. Certainly don't sit down and pay attention to what your feelings say about a problem. And that is not to say that we give in to our feelings, right? Our feelings are indicator lights to help us recognize what is actually going on in our real life. And if we, again, do not stop toiling, then we do not have the time and the space to ask the Lord, what is this emotion telling me? Where is this anger coming from? Why am I so anxious about this relationship with this person? If I am unwilling to stop and ask the Lord and sit in his presence and read his word and pray for discernment about that, then I will continue to have broken family relationships. I will continue to operate in emotional unhealth. I will continue to project my feelings onto other people because I really have no idea how I actually feel and what the Lord wants me to do with that. Last thing, I promise. I think that, so in Isaiah, the Lord is trying to convict Israel and basically calling them out and saying that you would like, success and independence to be where your worth is coming from. And I'm calling you to rest, and I'm calling you to dependence on me. And I think that we have to recognize that in every single one of us, especially myself, there is a desire for self-sufficiency and for independence, and that is not the way that the Lord calls us to live.
Yeah. All right. So Natasha, thank you, Liz. Natasha, we've talked about these patterns to prioritize and avoid in the life of the pastor, in the life of the ministry and the congregation, ministers in the congregation. Let's talk about the household. So the Christian household, what are some of these patterns and rhythms that we can, again, prioritize, avoid, to encourage dedication, but also guard against restless toil?
So when I think about a family structure, a family unit, obviously, in general, as a Christian family, you are for the Great Commission, you're on mission together, but I think each individual family is going to have their own distinctives. So I think, firstly, we need to be discovering and being intentional about what are our values as a family. Who are we going to be and what are we going to accomplish? Kind of like Morgan said, at the end of our life, when we look back, what is it that we want to have done? Of course, just me as a person, but also we get this privilege to raise a family in a certain direction. So I think doing that, then you know your best yeses and your best nos, and that is going to guard you against anxiously toiling, becoming restless, becoming burnt out, while also helping you to actively, intentionally live on mission together and be going in a certain direction together. So I do think that is a place to, for sure, start. I'll give kind of a practical example, because there's so many. Obviously, you've got your family devotions, you've got rhythms of rest, hospitality. So I'll share for us, there was a season of our life where Sundays after the gathering was sort of our time to engage in hospitality. We would just invite whoever was sitting next to us over for lunch after. And for a season that was quite fruitful, but for me, that is also a pouring out. And so when you think of the concept of rest, prioritizing a Sabbath day, then you've got, the Sunday gathering, you've got sometimes you're coming back to church, you've got church-wide prayer, you've got different things going on that day. Does that day end up being a day of rest, or are you just constantly pouring, and not stopping to have that margin? And so we began to shift that and say, okay, how can we be intentional? Our family, we will actually write the names down of people that we want to engage with, whether that's inviting over for a meal or just meeting up for a walk or coffee. Like, who are we intentionally pursuing to connect with in relationship? But that had to be a different day of the week so that we could have time to rest. Because if we're constantly going to the next thing, and that could be sports, that could be, the things that we decide we're going to let our children do. If we're just going, there is no way that we're going to be living as a collective group going in that direction of our values, if that makes sense. So I will say margin, Sabbath is important. I think there is a place for just that one day a week, whatever day that is for you, depending on your lifestyle. It needs to be a priority, and I think there are also other aspects of that where maybe husband goes off for a day and has intentional time with the Lord. Wife might do that too another day, and maybe that's quarterly, like not as often as once a week, or you can kind of decide for what works for you. But I think that does help you to stay on point with where we're going. There's actually a book that, if you have not read this book already, it's called Habits of the Household, Justin Whitmel Early. It is fantastic, and he talks about all the different categories, from how you consume media as a family to how you do Sabbath rest to how you do engage in hospitality and do family devotions. Like, every pattern and rhythm that you kind of flow in or would want to as a family, he breaks it down, gives the theological backing, but also the practical, and I would highly recommend it. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Natasha. Well, yes, give it up for our first panel of the day. We will have two more panels throughout the day. I'm loving this debrief that we'll have, which brings us to our first giveaway of the day. There's nothing I like more than to make people